As I lay on the cold hospital bed, the white sheets felt rough against my skin. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor beside me. I was tired, both physically and mentally, with the weight of my condition pressing down on me. Dr. Wilson had visited earlier and explained that I had an ulcer. He told me that it was partly because I had been holding in a lot of negative emotions. "I recommend you talk to someone, Mrs. Evans. Holding on to those emotions isn't good for your health," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I'll think about it, doctor," I replied, nodding slowly. Soon after Dr. Wilson left, David entered. My husband of 15 years, David was a tall man with brown hair that was starting to gray at the temples. His suit was impeccable, always tailored to perfection. However, his face now showed signs of stress and impatience. "Jane," David started, clearing his throat, "I've been doing some thinking." I turned to look at him, waiting for him to continue. He took a deep breath. "I want a divorce." I felt a pang in my chest, but not of heartbreak, more of realization. It felt like something I had been expecting for a long time. "All right," I said simply. David looked taken aback. "That's it? Just all right?" "I guess I've seen it coming, David," I admitted, "though I never thought you'd tell me while I'm in a hospital bed." A nurse, Melissa, who was attending to some paperwork nearby, looked up. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with bright blue eyes and blonde hair pulled into a ponytail. She gave me a concerned look. "Are you okay, Mrs. Evans?" David scoffed. "Of course she's fine. Aren't you, Jane?" I ignored him, turning to Melissa. "I'll be okay. Thanks for asking." "Why are you so calm about this?" Melissa whispered, genuinely curious. With a small smile, I leaned in closer. "I have a little secret. Something that will make everything all right in the end." David, not hearing our exchange, glanced between us, looking annoyed. "I'll get the papers started then," he said tersely. As he left the room, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of sadness and relief. I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life. And though the circumstances weren't ideal, I felt strangely hopeful. The hospital room was quiet, with only the soft murmur of the TV in the background. I started to drift into a state of introspection, remembering simpler times. The day David and I met felt like it was just yesterday. We were introduced by mutual friends at a local coffee shop. The initial days were filled with laughter, shared interests, and many dreams for the future. "Jane, have you ever thought about traveling the world?" David had once asked me during one of our early dates. "I've always wanted to," I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. "But life gets in the way. Work, responsibilities." David smiled warmly. "Maybe we can do it together one day." I chuckled. "That sounds like a dream." But as the years went on, things changed. David got a high-paying job, and suddenly, money became a focal point in our lives. We moved into a big house, drove expensive cars, and attended high-profile events. It was a life many dreamed of, but it felt empty to me. "I bought another painting today," David said one evening, showing off a piece of artwork that cost more than what I earned in a month at the bookstore. "It's beautiful," I replied, trying to show enthusiasm. But deep inside, I missed our simpler days, when happiness wasn't measured in monetary terms. The stark difference in our earnings soon became a sore point. David would often berate me for not making enough and for spending too much time at the bookstore. "Jane, can't you find a better job? Something that pays more?" he once asked. "This is what I love, David," I retorted, frustration evident in my voice. "I thought you of all people would understand." His reply was cold. "Well, love doesn't pay the bills." Health concerns started adding to our strained relationship. The constant pain in my stomach became unbearable at times. I remember one particularly bad night when I was curled up in pain. "Jane, are you okay?" David's voice was filled with annoyance rather than concern. "My stomach, it hurts so much," I managed to whisper. "You're always sick," he snapped. "Maybe if you didn't stress about that bookstore so much, you'd feel better." Even during those tough times, there was one person who stood by me, my grandmother. She was a wise old woman with a heart of gold. We shared many moments, sipping tea and talking about life. "He's not right for you," she told me during one of our conversations. I sighed. "I know, Grandma, but we've been together for so long." She looked at me with a knowing smile. "Sometimes length doesn't mean depth. Remember that." Her words stayed with me. David's decision to ask for a divorce might have been sudden for him, but for me, it was a long time coming. And as I lay in the hospital bed, clutching the letter from the notary, I felt a sense of clarity and direction for the first time in years. My grandmother had passed, leaving me $3 million. But there was a catch. I would only inherit it upon divorcing Robert. A bittersweet smile formed on my lips. Once an unwelcome condition, now it was my ticket to freedom. The next morning, I decided it was time to take charge of my life. I needed to know why David was so eager for the divorce. Was there another woman? Or was there something else he wasn't telling me? I decided to call Mark, a lawyer I had known since childhood. We had grown up together, and even though life took us on different paths, our bond remained. "Jane, long time. How are you holding up?" Mark's voice sounded genuinely concerned. "Been better, Mark," I replied, trying to sound upbeat. "But I need your help." Mark paused for a moment. "What do you need?" I hesitated. "I need to know why David wants a divorce so urgently. Can you find out?" There was a short silence. "You think he's up to something?" "I just have a gut feeling. Something's off." "All right," Mark said. "I'll hire a detective to tail him, see what he's up to." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. "Thank you, Mark." A few days later, Mark called with news. "Jane, you were right. David's been seeing someone." My heart sank. "Who is she?" "He's been spending time with a young girl, probably in her 20s. Tall, model-like. Our detective has taken some photos." I sighed. "I need to see them." Mark arranged for me to meet with the detective later that day. The detective, a stern-looking man named Carl, showed me several pictures of David and the young woman. "That's him." Carl pointed to David in one of the photos. "And her name is Clara. She's a student, but has an interesting past." "What do you mean?" Carl hesitated. "She's been involved with a few rich men before. It seems she has a pattern." I felt a rush of anger. "So, she's using him?" Carl shrugged. "Looks like it, but there's more. We found out she's currently working for an escort service." I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. "Thank you, Carl." As I left the detective agency, a plan began to form in my mind. David wanted a divorce? Fine. But I wasn't going to let him walk away without a fight. He would regret the day he decided to betray me. The following week was a blur of hospital tests and treatments. But between the needles and medications, I had a surprise visitor, an elderly man named Mr. Graham, whom I had occasionally seen during my daily hospital walks. With white hair, a cane, and wise eyes, he seemed to be always engrossed in a book. "Hello, Jane," he greeted me with a warm smile as he walked into my room. "Hello, Mr. Graham. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I've heard you work at a used bookstore," he said, taking a seat near my bed. "Yes, I do. It's a small place, but it has its charm." He nodded appreciatively. "I've always had a passion for books. Over the years, I've collected many rare editions. And, well, there's one particular book I thought you might be interested in." My curiosity was piqued. "Which book?" "It's an old, rare copy of Pride and Prejudice. You see, my late wife loved that book. She told me stories about her family's connection to it." I was taken aback. "That's one of my favorites. I've always wanted to have a rare edition." Mr. Graham smiled kindly. "I thought so. Well, I'm willing to sell it to you." "That's a generous offer," I said, my heart racing. "But there's a problem. I recently had some financial issues. David, my husband, took all the money from our joint account." Mr. Graham frowned. "I'm sorry to hear that. But for the book, we can work out a reasonable price, or even a payment plan." I smiled, touched by his kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Graham. I'd like that." Our chat was interrupted by a call on my mobile. It was David. "Jane, have you signed the papers yet?" he demanded. "Not yet, David. I told you, I'll do it after I leave the hospital." "Just get it done," he said irritably before hanging up. I sighed, feeling deflated. Mr. Graham looked at me with sympathy. "Relationship troubles?" I nodded. "He's eager to get rid of me." Mr. Graham leaned forward. "You know, life has a way of bringing unexpected joys even in the midst of our struggles. Perhaps this book is a small token of that." I smiled, wiping away a tear. "Thank you, Mr. Graham. You have no idea how much this means to me." As he left the room, I held the book close, feeling a strange sense of comfort. In the midst of chaos and heartbreak, this little piece of literature became a beacon of hope. After my release from the hospital, I met with Mark to strategize our next steps. The evidence against David was strong, and I was ready for confrontation. Mark handed me a file. "Everything you need is here. Pictures, documents, everything." I nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. "Thanks, Mark. I appreciate everything you've done. He looked at me seriously. Just remember, be strong. David might try to manipulate or guilt trip you. I'm ready, I affirmed. The confrontation was set for an upscale restaurant downtown. David had chosen the place, probably to flaunt his financial superiority. As I walked in, I saw him seated at a corner table with Clara, the young model. Her presence was unexpected, but made me more determined. David smirked as he saw me. Took you long enough. Traffic, I replied curtly. He gestured to Clara. You remember Clara, my secretary? I smiled sweetly at her. Of course, how could I forget? David, eager to get things underway, said, So, have you signed the papers? I looked at Mark, who handed over a document. David quickly scanned it, his smirk fading. What's this? He asked, sounding genuinely confused. It's a demand for a significant share of your assets, Mark replied coolly. David laughed. On what grounds? Mark slid over the pictures of David and Clara. On these grounds, infidelity. Clara looked horrified, her eyes darting between the pictures and David. David's face went red. This doesn't prove anything. Mark wasn't fazed. It's enough, and there's more. He handed over another set of photos, showing Clara with different men. David looked at Clara, betrayal evident on his face. What is this, Clara? Clara stammered. I can explain. I chimed in. No need. Mark already explained to me about your profession. David looked crushed. His grand plan had backfired spectacularly. I decided it was time to deliver the final blow. Oh, and by the way, David, my grandmother passed away and left me a substantial amount, so don't worry about the dinner bill. I've got it. The look on David's face was priceless. The combination of shock, regret, and realization was almost poetic. I stood up. This is the last time you'll see me, David. Goodbye. Walking out of the restaurant, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. I was finally free from David's toxicity, and it was time for a fresh start. The past few weeks after the restaurant incident had been a whirlwind of changes. The whole town buzzed with news of David's fall from grace, and the whispers and pointed fingers were unavoidable whenever he made a public appearance. One afternoon, my phone rang, displaying David's number. I hadn't expected him to call ever again. Still, out of sheer curiosity, I answered. Hello? Look. David's voice was rough, almost desperate. I need to ask you something. My defenses immediately went up. What do you want? He hesitated, and I could almost picture him struggling for words. I need a loan. I raised an eyebrow. You want money from me? Yes, he sighed, his voice breaking a little. I spent a lot on Clara, on gifts, travels, everything she asked for. Plus, there are debts I've accumulated. I thought I had it under control, but now with everything falling apart, I just need some help to get back on my feet. His confession did give me a moment of satisfaction, but I remembered how he had treated me in the past, his condescending words and attitude. You told me once that I shouldn't spend money on myself because I'm an uninteresting woman, I said coldly, recalling his exact words. Why should I help you now? He was silent, likely recalling that painful memory. I waited. I'm sorry for what I said, he replied. It was wrong, but I really need this. I took a deep breath. David, you made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences. I won't help you. I could hear the desperation growing in his voice. Please, just think about it. I'll do anything. No, I responded firmly. Goodbye, David. I hung up and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past finally starting to lift off my shoulders. I was in control of my life now, and no one could take that away from me. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, everyone exchanging opinions and whispers, but my focus was sharp. I looked straight ahead, bracing myself for the face-off. The mahogany doors opened, and in walked David, his hair disheveled, and his face reflecting sleepless nights. He still managed to look charming, but I saw through it. Mark, my lawyer, stood tall beside me. Stay strong, he whispered. Today is the day we set things right. David approached hesitantly, his eyes pleading. Can we talk? Just for a minute? I nodded towards Mark, signaling him to give us a moment. Make it quick. David took a deep breath. I'm so sorry. I realize the pain I've caused. Please, can we not do this? Can we not make it a public spectacle? His words seemed genuine, but years of deceit had made me wary. David, this isn't about you anymore. It's about justice. He looked defeated, but tried one more time. Isn't there any room for forgiveness? For us to start afresh? I stared at him coldly. There's no us anymore. And as for forgiveness, some things can never be forgiven. You chose this path. Before he could respond, the bailiff announced the judge's arrival. Everyone took their seats. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern face, spoke. This court is now in session. Mark began. Your Honor, my client has suffered emotional and financial turmoil due to Mr. David's actions. The evidence will showcase his deceit. David's attorney tried to interrupt, but Mark continued, Your Honor, we have photographs, bank records, and messages that point towards Mr. David's consistent betrayal. The evidence was presented, one piece after another, creating an irrefutable chain of David's misdeeds. David looked shattered, realizing the gravity of the situation. Your Honor, he began, voice shaky, I admit my mistakes, but I beg the court and my wife for leniency. Mark countered, Mr. David is only remorseful because he got caught. Had any of these deceitful actions not come to light, he would have continued his ways. The judge, after pondering for a while, said, Given the overwhelming evidence, this court grants the divorce. Mrs. will receive 80% of the combined assets. David was aghast. This is extreme. I stood up, anger evident in my voice. Extreme? Like your affairs? Or draining our accounts? Or every lie you told? David whispered, Please, just give me a chance. I looked at him squarely. I gave you years, David. You destroyed that chance every time. Walking out of the courtroom, Mark congratulated me. You did great. This chapter is closed. I nodded, determined. It's time to rebuild and move forward, without him. The sun outside shone brilliantly, signaling a new dawn, and for the first time in years, I felt truly free. The sky was a bright shade of blue, and the air was fresh, with a hint of morning dew. It had been a month since the court case, and the world seemed different to me. I was sitting in a small cafe near the beach, enjoying a cup of coffee, watching children play in the sand and families laughing together. Sarah, my longtime friend, joined me at the table, her presence always a comfort. How does freedom feel? She asked with a teasing smile. It feels like breathing without any weight on my chest, I replied, taking a sip from my mug. She chuckled. I never understood why you held on for so long. I sighed. Neither did I, but it's in the past now. I'm just focusing on what's ahead. A small boy, around 6, ran up to our table, his sandy feet leaving prints. Excuse me, ma'am. Can you help me build a sandcastle? I smiled at his innocence. Sure, why not? As we sat building the castle, Sarah watched with a soft smile. You know, you always had a way with kids. Have you thought about what you're going to do next? Actually, I have, I began, molding the sand into a tower. I'm thinking of starting a community center for children, somewhere they can come, learn, and play. Sarah looked pleasantly surprised. That sounds amazing, but it's going to be a lot of work. I'm ready for it. I've been tied down for so long. It's time I did something that truly matters. The day wore on, and Sarah and I talked about everything under the sun, memories, future plans, and the latest town gossip. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a golden hue on the horizon, I stood up, stretching my legs. You know, Sarah, it's moments like these that I miss the most. Simple, peaceful, just enjoying life. Sarah nodded. You've come a long way. A familiar face approached our table. Mark. He looked different in casual wear, less the stern lawyer, and more like an old friend. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said, a smile playing on his lips. Not at all, I replied. Have a seat. He sat down. I was in the area and thought I'd check on you. How have you been? Better, I said. Much better. Sarah, always the tease, chimed in. You two should hang out more. You're both single, after all. Both Mark and I blushed, exchanging an awkward glance. Well, we can always start with a coffee, Mark suggested. I laughed. Sounds like a plan. As night fell, the three of us walked along the beach, feeling the waves touch our feet, the vastness of the ocean reminding me of the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Life was no longer about the past. It was about seizing the day, making a difference, and perhaps, just maybe, finding happiness again. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The community center became a reality, a place bustling with kids, laughter, and learning. Mark and I grew closer, our bond strengthened by mutual respect and understanding. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my new home, looking at the vibrant colors of the setting sun, Mark came up behind me. You've done it, he whispered. I turned to face him. We did it. Together. He pulled me into a hug, and we stood there, looking out at the horizon, knowing that the past was behind and a new dawn awaited. And as the first stars twinkled in the early night sky, I realized that sometimes endings are just new beginnings.